The G7 summit wrapped up in Hiroshima just a few days ago. The communique sternly criticized Beijing for its human rights violations and its growing assertiveness in the Indo-Pacific region. While the relations between the US and China has sunk to its lowest in decades, China has grown to become the world's second biggest economic powerhouse. It is an important trading partner with the European Union and various other global industries that also depend on China. The question is, how will these countries respond as the US-China relations are locked in a stalemate? To answer this and a lot more, we have with us Dr. John Kuenkel. He's a former Chief of Staff to former Prime Minister of Australia, Scott Morrison, and also former trade advisor to the Australian Minister of Trade. And he's joining us live from Sydney. Thank you so much for joining us on WION, Doctor.
No problem.
Right now, the relations between the US and Europe have become closer over the war in Ukraine. Trade between the EU and China have expanded rapidly in the last few years. But EU and China are also each other's largest trading partner as of 2023. In your viewpoint, how do you think Europe will be able to balance its needs while trading with China amidst worsening US-China relations?
Look, I think it's important not to see this in just a binary context. It's true, as you point out, that US-China relations are at a particularly low ebb, and that's sort of been the case with the spy balloon episode from earlier in the year. But there are also, I think you can also see steps both by the Americans and the Europeans, separate from the G7, to try to send a coordinated signal to Beijing, which is really around this issue of de-risking rather than decoupling relationships. So whilst it's true, America and China are in an area of economic conflict, and they really have been for a few years, going back to Donald Trump and the tariffs that were put on. And it's certainly true that under President Biden, that's really gone an extra step in terms of advanced technology. But I think there's also a recognition among European leaders that they need to work through these issues with the United States. And it's also important not to just see these as the outcrop of US policy. I mean, China's been on a drive for economic self-sufficiency as well. It's had a series of practices around technology transfer and industrial espionage that's led to this reaction. And it's also the case that whilst a lot of European companies are certainly highly dependent on the Chinese market, there's also been, I think, a degree of realism within Europe with Ursula von der Leyen and others about we're dealing with a different China from a decade ago.
Absolutely, Doctor. Just to add to that, the European Union sanctions are also more cautious on hitting China during its 11th round of sanctions. The EU clearly says that alternative measures should be considered before the bloc restricts trade. Do you think that the EU is going soft on China at the moment?
I wouldn't necessarily put it that way. I think a lot of countries, and certainly I'd include Australia in this, are concerned about a fragmentation of the global economy. Basically, a lot of countries, not just China, have done pretty well through the integration and globalization era of the last 30 years, and they don't want to see that all picked apart. And to be fair, I don't think that's what the Americans are saying either. They certainly have concerns about China as a strategic rival. They're certainly clear about seeking to stop China, if you like, getting the commanding heights of the global technology economy. But equally, some of those concerns are shared. And if you look at speeches by Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, and Janet Yellen, the Treasury Secretary, in recent times, there's a sort of a careful attempt there to also, I think, send a message to Beijing that it's not about decoupling, it's not about blocking China's economic rise. Now, there's probably a fair degree of cynicism in Beijing about those messages. But I think what the G7 underscores is that we're going to be in this world for an awfully long time. There's frankly a little bit making it up as it goes along, how the West, or the West plus, the West including NATO, including countries like Japan, South Korea and Australia and others, as well as Europe, deal with China in the 21st century, and particularly when you also have this close axis with Russia and Iran as well. So I think we have to be realistic. We are in a new era. we are in an era of strategic competition that really has been different from the previous one we've been in with globalization. But also, a lot of these things are happening separate to what governments are doing. I mean, you look at the result of the pandemic, that's also underlined the degree to which long, thin supply chains leave countries vulnerable. So there are a number of other factors here that are happening independent of US-China rivalry, and all countries are having to navigate that.
Right, Doctor. Now, during the G7 summit, all the countries took a firm stand against China's economic version. You speak of how realistic steps should be taken to counter China's economic power, which is only growing. Talk to us more about the economic threats posed by Beijing and also the scale of China's economic powerhouse coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic.
Well, look, there's no doubt that China, growing at roughly 10% a year for 30 plus years or even longer, has created enormous economic power with an enormous market. And a lot of countries, including US allies and partners, they don't want to sort of just try to break that relationship. They need to maintain a good working relationship with Beijing, in part for economic reasons, but in part also just for realpolitik reasons, that we need to sort of stabilise relations and sort of rub along, if you like. So that said, I think China has displayed over the last decade, particularly under President Xi, a preparedness to weaponize economic relationships. It did that with South Korea, it did that with Japan, it certainly did that with Australia in recent years. And that's, to be honest, led to a degree of distrust about China. And, is it really prepared to play by the rules? Or is it purely about creating a new form of balance where it has dominance, particularly in the Indo-Pacific region? So I think there's, certainly you're seeing a strong US reaction, but it's not coming out of a vacuum. It's happened, I think, with a more aggressive China, a more coercive China. Now, what we have to be very careful about is that we don't lapse into forms of economic nationalism and protection, which actually won't build our economic resilience as democracies, as liberal democracies, if you like. So there's always a balance to be struck about the degree to which governments get involved in trying to manage trade relations, but basically leaving it to private individuals and companies to get on with business as well.
Right, Dr. John, you're joining us live from Sydney. Reports also suggest that there is a growing China-Australia trade relationship. In the latest sign of a thaw in the economic relationship with China, Australian timber will be exported to China. Talk to us more on that.
Yeah, well, look, this has been a very difficult period, and going back really to under Malcolm Turnbull as Prime Minister, where Australia took some steps around, for example, the place of Huawei in our 5G network, taken further in different ways by Prime Minister Morrison in terms of investment and other things. But then China sought, in a sense, to lash back and did it in a range of areas: coal, timber, lobster, a whole range of our export, barley. Barley was a case where we took a WTO case. Now, under the Albanese government, we're trying to, as they put it, stabilise relations and work through these trade issues. And what we're really trying to do is just to get back to some sort of stable trade footing. That said, I think the Albanese government has also largely locked on to the strategic direction that was already there under the previous government. But we are seeking to rebuild our trade relationships. But in essence, that's going back to a period before China put a series of trade sanctions on Australia. Now, we're nowhere near there yet. It will take a period of time. I think we have to be clear that any relaxation of these trade restrictions is very much in China's interest as well. I think China understood, frankly, that they overreached in a lot of these areas and created a lot of distrust, as I said before, not just in Australia, but in countries like Canada, in countries like Lithuania, where various sorts of measures were taken where you saw public trust and favourability towards China really plunge in a lot of countries over the last 3 to 4 years. So China, I think, has recognised that it did overreach, and it's now seeking to move back to a more stable framework, frankly, in its own interests. But also, I think there's a clear strategic interest in China in trying to, if you like, have elements of dissent within the West about its economic relations. They don't want countries like Australia and like European countries simply following on in an American sort of wave, if you like, and on things like economic restrictions or technology restrictions. So there's a place for, I think, all countries trying to carve out their own political sovereignty and economic sovereignty and not just be drawn into this sort of binary US-China rivalry.
Well, absolutely, Doctor. Thank you so much for joining us on WION and sharing your insights with us. Thanks very much.
No problem. Thank you.